How good's that first morning? It's been great, hasn't it? And look, the fun keeps continuing, but rippling through the morning sessions was this theme of, the left and the right and the fighting and the seeing things through the prisms of certain eyes, their own eyes, not understanding the other side. And I thought it'd be useful for us to hear from a man who's written extensively on this, his last book being Fragile Nation. He writes regularly for the Financial Review. He's a qualified psychiatrist. He's been active in local council, and he is very insightful on this and will hopefully help us make some sense of all this. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tanveer Ahmed.
Thanks, Ed. Oh. Thanks. Is that all right? Thanks very much, Andrew, and it's a pleasure to be invited to the inaugural version of this conference, and thanks to all of you for attending, and the half of what I saw this morning was really superb. And I congratulate Andrew for being able to put this together amid some unique challenges. I know Andrew from promoting my last book, and he's based in Queensland. And right from then, I could see he was a very excellent operator. I remember he held a great event at a sort of period type pub in sort of inner city Brisbane. And right then, you could see he was a fantastic organiser. And this event and the success of it already shows a degree of evolution in his powers. So congratulations to Andrew. Look, I guess at the outset, I think I'd initially like to speak just to some of the controversy sort of tied to the conference, especially some. I'm sure you've heard a bit of it from in the morning, but I'd like to give my sort of piece about it from the criticism from the likes of, say, Senator Christina Keneally. Now, sure, some of the sort of colourful international speakers like Rahim Kassam, who's on later, might be considered firebrands locally, but I actually think it is worth dwelling on it a bit more because it gives us a point of why, say, Labor or the social justice side of politics just cannot seem to win an election in the Anglo sphere, if you like. Now, it's become a kind of blasphemy in such circles to raise even the slightest concern or constructive criticism regarding matters of race, immigration, or gender. And arguably because of that, I'm speaking to you at a conference like this and have been, I guess, politicised over the years. They've become untouchable zones, immediately inviting sort of accusations of sort of racism or sexism. Another you could think of is, say, climate change. Any kind of scepticism about the most apocalyptic predictions, and immediately you're called a climate denier. It's something of a heretic, particularly in polite society or amongst educated professionals. Now, this even extended to economic matters in our recent federal election here in Australia, where many of what should have been Labor's base were called the top end of town, successful tradesmen or small businessmen, and this was particularly the case in where I lived, sort of in inner Sydney. So what then happens is the so-called progressive just keep alienating more and more of the community who either have genuine concerns about rapid changes to their community and the economy, and guess what? They vote for somebody else. You look at recent events in the Anglosphere with the financial crisis, we had the Banking Royal Commission. There's huge antipathy and anger towards the ruling classes. Yet Labor has a distaste of capturing it, but is only able to stoke the anger even more by not acknowledging not even acknowledging the anger, but accusing anyone who's dissatisfied of various kinds of prejudice or privilege. Now, that anger, not only has it been harnessed elsewhere, they can't be surprised that the focus on identity politics and grievance is now being returned in magnified quantities, particularly in countries like the UK and the US. Now, look, as Andrew suggested, I'm a psychiatrist, I guess, who has had involvement in journalism and politics in parallel. And I work sort of in the outer suburbs, regional areas, and despite coming from, say, a Bangladeshi Muslim household, that's really given me a kind of greater sensitivity to some of the wider trends. So in some ways, through the consulting room and through my writing, I think I bring sort of a different angle to some of the wider issues that are going on in the world. And I want to touch on some of that to you today, and I hope that adds to what is already a fantastic program. And I do find it sometimes odd being in a venue like this and being kind of labelled, oh, you're a conservative, and what exactly that might mean. If I look at many of the issues that I'm interested in through my work, say issues like family breakdown, a rise in loneliness, a decline of, say, a collective identity, be it through religion or nationalism, the decline of a moral language. And we heard John Anderson talking a little bit about this. The withering trust in institutions or unfulfilling jobs. Now, what's especially interesting about these problems, they don't have easy left or right solutions. They're less about individual rights and more about our institutions, our attachments, and the nature of our relationships. And part of how I've probably come to be at a conference like this is that I didn't necessarily subscribe, and I'll touch on this a bit more, to the prevailing ideas around it's all about power structures and victim hierarchies. And even as a doctor, you should be driven by the truth, be it biological truths, be it social truths, be it a range of truths. But increasingly in today's day and age, that can be frowned upon. And I think another interesting thing to think about at a conference whose underlying theme is freedom, I think it's worth pondering that on the economic, let's say economic on the right, social on the left, liberalism, or the ideas around individual rights and freedom have been tremendously successful. There's no question about that. The last half century. I mean, the rise in prosperity across the world is historically unprecedented. I mean, likewise, the greater freedoms and opportunities for people of all ilks is extraordinary. And I'm a great example. I'm the child of Bangladeshi immigrants. My parents grew up in a Bangladeshi village. That was certainly skilled migrants. And the opportunity I've had, the elite education and the social mobility that I've been offered in a country like ours is really quite extraordinary. And there'd only be a handful of countries in the world that could possibly offer this. So this liberalism is sort of a celebration of individual choice and the fulfillment of desire, but arguably also an ambivalence to human association. So I think this points to some of the issues. I'd love you to consider there's a guy called Mikhail Remezov, and I've written about this in one of my columns in the Financial Review. And he's a Russian philosopher, and he was sort of seen as fairly close to Putin. And he gave a very interesting analysis after Trump won. He said, to a significant degree, it was a reversion to a religious view of man. And I thought this was a very interesting, and that didn't necessarily mean that he was saying that it was the religious right or religious people. More of a conception of man and not being the essence of man, not being fundamentally about freedom, which sometimes, liberalism, I guess, conceives of man, but also the traditional resources, or the resources of traditional society, be it community, commitment to others, a sense of place, or as well as a metaphysical dimension to life. So I thought this was a very interesting analysis, and it certainly overlapped with some of the things I saw in my work in terms of what was affecting people in terms of trying to make sense of their lives. Now, a bit more personally about myself. So born in Bangladesh, came here, I guess one of those people, so I did well at school, became a doctor, but I got attracted to psychiatry in particular because I saw around me just these issues of identity. We're talking in the mid to late 90s, so well before, say, terrorism, etc. And I remember being interested. I came from a not terribly religious family. And Bangladesh is an interesting country in itself because it was conceived in a sort of conflict between secular humanism, secular sort of nationalism, and Islamism. So it was different to Pakistan there, and it split from Pakistan, partly because it tried to opt for a country more based on secular humanism. Now that remains in tension right throughout. So arguably my household was probably of that tradition, where it was more tied to a secular humanistic sort of literary, and my mother was obsessed with Tagore. Some of you will be familiar with him, that kind of thing. Whereas a lot of the people around me were relatively religious. Their parents weren't necessarily religious, but I found it very interesting that a lot of the people I grew up with were turning to a kind of what they saw as a pure version of Islam. And I found it fascinating. One, there's almost a part of me a bit jealous because I didn't feel like I belonged. I was like, well, I'm not terribly religious. I might have gone to the mosque, etc., but I wouldn't say I ever believed terribly strongly, and nor was it pushed by my parents. So it got me interested. And I remember I did an elective partially in Britain, and I saw that there were higher rates of mental health presentations among the South Asian community there, particularly Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, but also Indians as well. And that's when that's partly what drew me to psychiatry. And what seemed to be going on was this group that were growing up amid conflicting value systems. So in the school playground or in outside, it was very much about individualism and self-fulfillment, etc. Whereas at home, it was all about tradition, collectivism, hierarchy, and a lot of, there's a lot very stifling to some respect. And a lot of the kids growing up in that environment, especially throughout adolescence, had a great deal of difficulty forming a coherent identity. And that is the time in adolescence where that's one of the key, tasks of adolescence, separating from your parents and forming a sense of identity through the relationships you have. So many of the people around me were struggling to do that through their friendships and relationships in the playground because they didn't necessarily feel a sense of belonging to mainstream society. And a lot of that really came more from home. Even though we might hear that it's about racism, discrimination, what I saw, it was actually much more about antipathy and unease in the home, wary that they'll lose their tradition, that they'll get lost in a kind of sea of freedom that was potentially damaging to them, to their sort of longer term prospects, if you like. So suddenly, that's when they started reaching for a particular version of Islam. And it was called, sometimes it's referred to as identity Islam, where it was more about outward markers, it'd be about beards, hijabs, it'd be about trying to get the literal meaning of what things meant through the Quran, because they saw their parents' version of Islam as stained by the cultural traditions. They didn't see that as a sort of pure version. And then they would look yonder, because they didn't feel utterly belonging to the national story, because we were too weak on that. Then suddenly they would feel stronger ties to the notion of the Ummah, which was the internationalist sort of Islamic, international Islamic community. And this I was observing this, and I didn't necessarily see that as particularly worrying or dangerous at the time. But soon after that, we had, you all know what happens, and that's defined, to a big part our age. We live in this age where identity, belonging is so at the heart of so much of our politics. And quite a few trends come out of that, those sort of observations. And now we see it in a whole range of areas. I mean, we've only seen last week 2 different types of shooters. So one, you had the El Paso, and definitely there was a version of white nationalism there. But then you had the other shooter, and much less has been said about this, and he came from the social justice movement. And he felt the same sense, but it certainly has overlaps with what I saw. Terrorism is a conflation. It's a mix of personal resentment mixed with some sort of political ideology of resentment. And they merge, and they're projected outwards. And it's usually people who can't accept their sort of individual faults and see all the problems out there in society. So we're having all types: social justice, white nationalism, Islamic terrorism. And they're all sort of united by a sense of, one, moral purity, a sense of some sort of exceptionalism. So even with Islamic, there's a real sense of combination of Islamic exceptionalism, historical injustice, and a sense of urgency that something had to be done right now. So they're all united by some of those trends. But I see it in a host of other areas. In my consulting room, I'll see it in things like, say, natural therapies. So it's a similar sort of trend where people see some version of purity, some sense that there's a wider corruption, and to them it might be kind of a pharmaceutical or some sort of human, scientific or laboratory corruption, and they see this as a reversion to some type of wider link with nature and some sort of moral purity. So these trends are playing out in a host of different areas, and it follows on to some of what John Anderson was saying early this morning about, as traditional religion splinters in a host of areas, you're getting a host of different types of ideologies that are, let's say, they're packaged as ideologies, or not even ideologies, they're packaged often in the glossy packaging of science, but only in the loosely. So science is still one of the biggest authority in our society. So now you have all these sort of ideologies which underneath it have elements of faith, but are packaged on the front with sort of dollops of science. But as soon as you strip away those dollops, underneath it is something else. So look, with that in mind, I think it's worth talking. Some of the trends around multiculturalism, I think, are worth thinking about. And I love this term, asymmetrical multiculturalism. And it's really this idea that the celebration of minority groups, be it Italians, Sri Lankans, Muslims, etc., is celebrated and to be encouraged. Yet any type of celebration of mainstream, be it Australian nationalism or Christianity, whatever it might be, is seen as somehow reducing inclusiveness. It's somehow diminishing the identity of others. And I think this is a big problem. So it crowds out the mainstream and builds resentment, and understandably so. And this is certainly a trend that I've seen throughout my community work. It's interesting, so many of these wider ideas did actually come from the left. In the 50s and 60s, a man called Michael Young, who some of you know, a British Labor MP, I mean, he was one of the first to write about working class communities and how housing commission estates would essentially dilute a sense of belonging. It was chipping away at the fabric of a sense of place, a sense of community. Yet the same groups don't necessarily see how immigration might do the same. And this is something I certainly see in my work in the suburbs. If you think of a city, it's worth thinking. I mean, in terms of visitors to Sydney, I welcome you, and this is certainly Australia's premier city. But it's worth thinking of a city like this, and it tells you a lot about politics because it certainly mirrors other big cities. So, inner city of Sydney, increasingly knowledge workers, a global sort of class, educated professionals. And they'll have important jobs, and they'll often have appropriate views for polite society, educated professionals, and certainly in the groups that probably many of us inhabit, but are sometimes uncomfortable about speaking up in. You go further down, suddenly in, say, the middle of the city, you'll get a mix of sort of, for ordinary families working two jobs. You'll have the police and the nurse. You'll have a lot of newly arrived immigrants too. And I think this is an important discussion in Australia because part of the reason we haven't necessarily built the same level of firebrands that we might see imported from elsewhere is because we've been far more successful than other parts of the world. And a huge reason for that is our skilled migrant policy. So we get skilled migrants in, they're far more likely to get good jobs, they're far more likely to rise up the ladder, much like my family. They're also more likely to intermarry. And this is quite an interesting point. Because when you have higher rates of unskilled or, say, refugee groups, and it's still important that we have a component of that, they're far less likely to rise up the ladder. They're more likely to marry within their group. And this is shown statistically, and particularly in places like Britain, this is certainly a problem. And the reason that's an issue, I mean, they should be free to marry whoever they want, right? But what that does, it potentially builds a stronger ethnic identity at the expense of a wider kind of civic national one. So that can be problematic. And in fact, Sydney, Melbourne researcher, immigration academic Bob Birrell actually found that Australia has amongst the highest sort of mixed marriage rates in the world. I think it's a very good statistic. A great term I heard throughout this was a term called solastalgia. And it means when your home no longer feels like home. It's a great term, and I think this is partly what's happening on. And I see it sometimes with this notion of white flight, where people are moving. And again, if we think about the city, knowledge workers, newly arrived immigrants in the middle of the city, and increasingly the outer metropolitan regions, you're getting the native populations, people who've been here for generations. And they're not moving for economic reasons, because it doesn't make sense. Most of the economic opportunities in the city. They're moving often for cultural reasons, to recreate a place of community and of home. And this isn't widely acknowledged. It's seen immediately if that discomfort is expressed, you're seen as somehow racist. And this is certainly what I see in my work, some of the things I talk about in terms of the rise in sort of mental health problems. A big part of it is a lack of collective identity. It's the decline of a moral or religious language. So then people don't have terminology to make sense of their experience. And I often look at terms like post-traumatic stress disorder. It's extraordinary that diagnosis has tripled in the time of the greatest prosperity and peace in human history. That's happened in the last couple of decades. But part of that is people can't conceptualise suffering in the same way they might have in the past. And it often falls to things like mental health diagnoses. And not always in a helpful way, because it can limit people. It can take away their sense of autonomy, and it doesn't have the same breadth. It medicalises their experience. Look, I think I want to say a little bit more about mental health. Another thing, I spoke about the racism, etc. A real problem that's come about of this is this term, and some of you would have heard it, is concept creep. And it's really that the measures of what we call racism, the measures of what we call sexism, in my work, the measures of what we call, say, violence, trauma, etc., have been steadily diluted. And while they were initially done for, I guess, altruistic reasons, that we would attract more people under the umbrella and that we might be able to help more people, addiction is another one, what it's actually done is contributed a far more sensitive environment, where people, not only do people perpetually feel either traumatised or attacked in some form, they also increasingly think the problem is outside of themselves. And this is a great deal of my work. We're trying to help people gain insight that part of their personality and part of their perceptions colour how they experience the world, and they have far more power to moderate that. There's no question times it is the outside political conditions, no question. It's not a reason to be completely apathetic or nihilistic about our wider world, not at all. But we have heightened perceptions and individual subjectivity, and when combined with the dilution of all the meanings that we have around bullying, trauma, racism, gender, this has really created a volatile environment where we just can't have reasoned types of where it's much more difficult to have reasoned discussion. Now I notice the time is almost running out. Look, I think the final thing, a couple of final things I'd like to say. I guess one of the big, a big conflict at the moment, and reading up about this conference, I'd never heard of CPAC till this conference was happening in Australia, but it was fascinating reading about it. And some of you might be familiar that last year one of their kind of headline speakers was Marianne Le Pen, from France, and she gave a very interesting speech, and certainly isn't traditionally what you'd think of as obviously sort of conservative. She certainly spoke about being kind of imprisoned by the EU, but at the same time she spoke much more about regulating the financial systems. She spoke of her affections for Bernie Sanders. It's not an obvious thing you would hear at a CPAC conference, I suspect. But I guess my point is, I think a broader tension that we have, and this is challenging for me as someone, not of, say, a white or Christian background, is certainly in Europe, this idea of conservative is kind of rested on what Mark Liller, and some of you will know him who writes about identity politics in the New York Times. He writes this in the New York Review of Books. Talks about how European sort of conservatives always rested on an organic conception of society. It says Europe is a single Christian civilization composed of different nations with languages and customs. These nations are composed of families, which are organisms too, differing but complementary roles and duties for mothers, fathers, and children. On this view, the fundamental task of society is to transmit knowledge, morality, and culture to future generations, perpetuating the life of the civilizational organism. It is not to serve an agglomeration of autonomous individuals bearing rights. That's a very important point. Look, given I'm running out of time, I'll leave it there, but I think just a final point I make is the reality is that modern societies have a weak moral and political consensus. As a psychiatrist, I think both sides of liberalism offer incomplete pictures of the human condition. I think in some ways we've strayed too far towards individual rights and to the detriment of human association. And that's the challenge for our societies in the coming decades, at least at a social level. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanveer. Tanveer, in my experience, is the kind of person you could spend hours talking to, because his insight into the human condition and the mind and how we communicate, to me, is fascinating.